There is a scent to genuine terror. It smells like sour copper and stale sweat. When the boarding klaxon screamed, the aliens in Sector 4 panicked, but the little human girl didn't run. Her pupils dilated, her breathing slowed. The galaxy was about to learn what Earth made the air in the lower administrative levels of Station Aegis always tasted like burnt dust and cheap recycled oxygen. It clung to the back of the throat, leaving a metallic tang that no amount of synthetic water could wash away. Harper hated that taste. She hated the persistent vibration of the deck plating beneath her boots, the flickering lumen strips that buzzed like dying hornets. And most of all, she hated the uniforms. The standard issue jumpsuits were designed for the broader, flatter frames of the galactic majority. On Harper, the gray canvas hung loose and abrasive, chafing her collar bones and swallowing her small frame. She sat perched on a reinforced plasteel stool, her pale fingers flying across a haptic ledger board. Shipment 409B. Industrial coolant. Acknowledged she was by all galactic standards entirely unremarkable to the diverse array of species bustling through the grimy corridor outside her kiosk. She was practically invisible. Humanity was a newcomer to the coalition, a minor footnote from a quarantine sector. Most aliens had never seen one. Those who did saw exactly what Harper presented: soft, flat-faced, unarmored, and entirely devoid of natural weaponry. No claws, no venom sacs, no exoskeleton. A heavy, wet thud echoed over the low hum of the station's life support. Harper didn't look up, but she felt the shift in air pressure. "You are in my path, soft skin." Harper stopped typing. She blinked, her gaze dropping to the massive three-toed foot planted inches from her boot. The foot belonged to a growl, a hulking, amphibious laborer with skin like wet concrete and a temperament to match. The air around him smelled of swamp rot and engine grease. "My apologies," Harper said. Her voice was quiet, carefully modulated to lack any sharp edges. She pulled her stool closer to the console, drawing her knees together, making herself as small as physically possible. The growl snorted, a wet, guttural sound that sprayed a fine mist of saliva onto the deck. He deliberately knocked his massive shoulder against her kiosk as he squeezed past, sending her data pad clattering to the floor. Harper didn't sigh, she didn't glare. She waited until the heavy footsteps faded down the hall before slipping off her stool to retrieve the device. "You capitulate too easily," a voice clicked from the shadows of the adjacent booth. Tuss leaned out. He was a Veil, a tall, spindly creature that looked like a cross between a mantis and a starved greyhound. His kitten was a dull, dusty brown, and his compound eyes reflected the harsh overhead lights in a dozen fractured images of Harper. "It's not capitulation, T-Kai's," Harper muttered, wiping a smear of engine grease off the screen with her thumb. "It's efficiency. He weighs 600 lb. I weigh 130. Arguing is a waste of calories." Tuss tilted his triangular head. "Your species is fragile. It is a wonder you survived your cradle world long enough to achieve spaceflight. You lack defensive physiology." Harper slid back onto her stool. Her back ached. Her left boot was pinching her heel right where a blister had formed 2 days ago. She was tired. She had been on shift for 11 hours, surrounded by creatures that could accidentally crush her rib cage if they tripped in the hallway. "We managed," she said flatly. Observe you, Harper, Tusk continued, his mandibles twitching, and what she had learned was a gesture of benign curiosity. When the loud noises occur, the venting of the plasma coils, the shouting of the dock workers, you flinch. Your heart rate elevates. I can hear it. It flutters like a trapped winged insect. You are in a constant state of low-level apprehension. Harper kept her eyes on the ledger. Shipment 410, a processed nutrients. Acknowledged he wasn't wrong. Stationation was loud, unpredictable, and dangerous. Back on Earth, humans had conquered the food chain through tools and spite. Out here, surrounded by species that evolved on high gravity death worlds or acidic ocean planets, humans were painfully squishy. Harper knew her role. She was an administrative clerk. She kept her head down, processed the shipping manifests, and took her credits back to her cramped bunk to sleep. I just don't like loud noises. Tuss, she lied softly. She didn't tell him that her heart didn't flutter out of fear. It fluttered out of a primal, deeply buried instinct. The noise, the sudden movements, they were stimuli. Her brain, wired by millions of years of mammalian evolution, was constantly assessing threat vectors. Every time a plasma coil vented, her adrenal glands twitched. Every time a growl roared in the corridor, her brain calculated the distance to the nearest exit, the structural integrity of the metal pipe resting by the door, the vulnerability of the alien soft orbits sockets. She suppressed it all. It was exhausting. It made her look jumpy. It made her look weak. You should request a transfer to the upper wards. Tusk clicked sympathetically, handing her a stack of physical shipping dockets. It is quieter, fewer predators. You would be safer among the hydroponics guilds. Maybe, Harper murmured, taking the dockets. The paper felt rough against her skin. I'll think about it. She didn't want to think about it. She just wanted a cup of coffee, the real stuff, not the chory flavored sludge they pumped out of the commissary synthesizers. She wanted to finish her shift. But the universe Harper was about to be reminded didn't care about what she wanted. The overhead lumen strips didn't just flicker this time. They died, plunged into sudden heavy darkness. Corridor fell dead silent for a fraction of a second. Then the emergency strobes kicked in. Vicious pulsing arcs of crimson light bathed the metal walls in blood-red intervals. Then came the sound. It wasn't the dull hum of a malfunction. It was a mechanical shriek. The boarding klaxons. Panic has a specific texture. It is chaotic, jagged, and entirely uncoordinated. When the klaxons began their rhythmic, ear-splitting wail, the administrative corridor erupted into a meat grinder of terrified bodies. Aliens of a dozen different species abandoned their kiosks and stalls, stampeding toward the central transit hub. Heavy boots and clawed feet slammed against the grating. Harper was thrown back against her console as a terrified bull, a creature covered in thick, coarse fur, barreled past its elbow, catching her squarely in the chest. The impact drove the air from her lungs in a sharp hiss. She tasted blood where her teeth caught the inside of her cheek. Harper Tuss' voice was barely audible over the siren. His long, spindly arms reached over the partition, grabbing the collar of her oversized jumpsuit. He hauled her into his kiosk just as a wave of frantic dock workers surged through the space she had just occupied. Pirates, Harper gasped, clutching her ribs. The pain was sharp, blooming hot beneath. Her skin Corsair's. Tusk clicked frantically, his compound. Eyes wide and unblinking. The deep void clans, they bypass the defense grid by latching onto the heavy cargo freighters. We must move. They will sweep the lower decks for slaves and salvage. The crimson strobes painted Tusk's terrified face in harsh lines. The smell of the station had changed. The dusty metallic scent was suddenly overpowered by the sharp acidic reek of fear pheromones released by a dozen different alien biologies. It smelled like sulfur and rotting citrus. It made Harper's nose burn. Thud, thud, thud. The sound vibrated up through the deck. Plating, it wasn't the frantic scattered running of the station workers. This was synchronized, heavy, deliberate. They breached Sector 3, Trekkies whispered, his mandibles vibrating so hard they rattled against his jaw. They are here. Hide, Harper breathed. She grabbed Tusk's rigid forearm, pulling him down beneath the heavy plastel counter of his kiosk. The space was meant for a single veil to store personal effects. It was cramped, suffocatingly dark, and smelled intensely of Tusk's dusty kitten and old ration wrappers. Harper curled her knees to her chest, pressing her back against the cold, vibrating bulkhead. Tusk folded his long limbs awkwardly, his breathing coming in ragged, high-pitched whistles. Stop breathing so loud, Harper whispered, pressing a hand over her own mouth to muffle her words. I cannot, Tusk wheezed. My spiracles, it is a physiological response to terror. Harper squeezed her eyes shut. She focused on her own body. Her hands were shaking. A fine tremor racked her fingers, traveling up her arms to her shoulders. It was the adrenaline. It was flooding her system, a massive toxic dump of chemicals screaming at her to run, fight, survive. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. She forced herself to take a breath through her nose, slow, measured. She held it for 3 seconds. Exhaled through her teeth. Control it. Pack it down. A shadow fell over the entrance to their kiosk, through the narrow gap beneath the counter. Harper saw them. Boots, massive, heavily armored boots caked in dried grease and fresh bright blue blood. The Corsairs. They were Corvette hulking bipedal carnivores that looked like flayed muscle wrapped in bone plating. They stood nearly 8 ft tall, carrying kinetic shredder rifles that hummed with a low, deadly vibration. One of them stepped into Tusk's kiosk. The deck groaned under its weight. Harper stopped breathing beside her. Tusk, trembling, intensified. The alien's high-pitched wheezing was impossibly loud in the confined space. The Corvette paused. It sniffed the air. A wet, snuffling sound like a hound catching a scent in the brush. The heavy boots pivoted. It was facing the counter. I hear you, little bugs, a voice rumbled. It wasn't spoken. It was ground out through a translator collar. The synthetic voice distorted and dripping with malice. A massive clawed hand slammed down on the top of the plastel counter. The impact rattled Harper's teeth. Dust shook loose from the ceiling, drifting down to coat her sweaty forehead. Come out. Maybe I only take your limbs. Tusk broke. The Valen let out a high, keening shriek of pure distilled terror. He scrambled backward, trying to push himself through the solid metal bulkhead, his limbs tangling in a frantic attempt to escape. The Corvette laughed, a harsh barking sound. The massive hand reached down, wrapping around the edge of the plastel counter. With a terrifying groan of stressed metal, the Corsair simply ripped the Desk away. The crimson emergency lights flooded. Their hiding spot, Harper blinked. Against the sudden glare, towering above them was the Corvette. Its face was a nightmare of exposed jaw, muscle, and multiple sets of black, unblinking eyes. It wore a crude rebreather mask, the tube snaking over its thick shoulders. It reached down, its massive claws snatching trachs by the thorax. Trachis screamed, a sickening crunch echoing as the Corsair's grip cracked his outer kitten. The alien dangled in the air, his long legs kicking uselessly against the heavy armor of the pirate. Harper stayed on the floor. She was on her hands and knees, staring at the scarred toes of the Corvette's boots. Her shaking had stopped. The fear was gone. It hadn't faded. It had crystallized. The cold, logical part of her brain, the part that filed shipping manifests and avoided heavy growl workers, shut off. An ancient dormant circuit breaker tripped. Inside her skull, the little clerk from Earth was gone. What remained was a primate, a cornered, soft-skinned primate staring at a predator, her pupils dilated, swallowing the irises entirely, pulling in every fraction of available light. The pain in her ribs vanished, numbed by a sudden massive spike of endorphins. Her perception of time altered. The pulsing red strobe seemed to slow down. The chaotic noise of the station faded to a dull, distant roar, replaced by the deafening rush of blood in her ears. She saw the heavy kinetic rifle slung loosely over the Corsair's shoulder. Unreachable. She saw the thick armor plating on its chest and legs, impenetrable. Then she saw the flexible, unarmored tubing of its rebreather mask, pulsing slightly with the creature's wet breaths. She saw the exposed fleshy gap between its collarbone armor and its thick neck. Her eyes darted to the floor when the desk was ripped away. A heavy, jagged shard of sheared plastel had fallen onto the grating. It was sharp. It was roughly the length of a butcher's knife. The Corvette tossed Trouse against the wall like a discarded rag. The Valen crumpled, gasping in pain. The pirate turned its massive head, its black eyes locking onto the small, fragile human kneeling on the floor. "What are you supposed to be?" the translator rasped. The Corsair reached a massive hand down toward Harper's face. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. Harper moved. It wasn't a martial arts maneuver. It wasn't a graceful, calculated strike born of military training. It was an explosion of coiled, desperate kinetic energy. Harper pushed off the deck plating with both legs, her muscles firing with a violent snap that bruised her own thighs. She didn't launch herself away. She launched herself inside the creature's guard. The Corvette's hand was still reaching down. Harper's left hand shot out, her fingers hooking violently onto the thick, rubbery tubing of the Corsair's rebreather. She didn't just pull, she dropped her entire body weight backward using gravity and her own momentum. The tube tore. A sharp hiss of pressurized gas erupted from the mask. The Corvette let out a startled, wet roar, its massive head jerking down toward the sudden breach. Its hands reflexively came up to its face. That was the opening. In her right hand, Harper gripped the jagged shard of sheared plastel she had snatched from the floor. She didn't slash with it. Slashing wouldn't penetrate the thick hide. She gripped it with both hands, the sharp edges biting deep into her own palms, and drove it upward with everything she had. She aimed for the soft, fleshy gap just beneath the jawline where the armor stopped. The plasteel shard sank in. It didn't go easily. Harper felt the sickening spongy resistance of thick muscle and cartilage giving way, hot, thick liquid smelling intensely of ammonia and rusted iron sprayed across her hands and face. The Corvath bellowed. The sound was deafening, shockwave of pain and rage that rattled Harper's bones. The massive creature thrashed. The back of its forearm caught Harper in the shoulder, throwing her across the kiosk like a broken doll. She slammed into the metal bulkhead, the back of her head bouncing off the wall, with a crack that made her vision swim with white-hot stars. She hit the floor hard, gasping for breath. The taste of copper flooded her mouth. Across the room the Corvath was staggering. The beast clawed frantically at its own neck. The jagged plastile shard was still lodged deep in its throat, severing something vital. Bright neon orange blood pulsed from the wound in thick, heavy spurts, painting the floor, the walls, the ruined desk. It took 3 steps toward Harper. Its black eyes were wide, the arrogant malice replaced by a sudden, utterly alien confusion. It was suffocating on its own blood. Harper didn't cower. She pushed herself up onto her knees. Her left arm hung uselessly at her side, the shoulder dislocated from the impact. Her face was smeared with the Corsair's orange blood, and her own red blood leaking from a split eyebrow. She looked like a demon dragged up from the lowest levels of a nightmare. She locked eyes with the dying predator. Her chest heaved, pulling in deep, ragged breaths of the chemical-laced air. She bared her teeth. It wasn't a smile, it was a snarl, a prehistoric feral grimace that promised nothing but violence. The Corvath stopped. It looked at the small, broken creature it had dismissed as prey. It looked at the bared, flat teeth, the unblinking, dilated eyes. The beast's knees buckled. It collapsed forward, its massive bulk crashing onto the deck plating with a final wet thud. It twitched once, its heavy claws scraping uselessly against the metal grating, and then lay still. The pool of orange blood spread rapidly, steaming slightly in the cool air of the corridor. Silence descended on the ruined kiosk, broken only by the distant muffled whip of the boarding klaxons and the frantic, shallow breathing of the survivors. Harper remained on her knees for a long time. She stared at the corpse. Adrenaline was still roaring through her veins, a raging fire demanding more fuel. Her hands flexed involuntarily. She wanted to hit it again. She wanted to make absolutely sure it was dead. Slowly, agonizingly, the fire began to recede. The primitive survivalist override disengaged, handing control back to the exhausted, terrified administrative clerk. The pain hit her all at once. Harper gasped, clutching her dislocated shoulder, her vision blurred, tears of pain and shock springing to her eyes. She slumped back against the bulkhead, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. The cold seeped into her bones. The metallic tang of adrenaline left a bitter taste on her tongue. A low, clicking sound came from the corner of the room. Thus, Harper turned her head. The Valen was huddled against the wall, cradling his cracked thorax. He was staring at her. He wasn't looking at her with gratitude. He wasn't looking at her with relief. He was looking at her with absolute, unadulterated horror. Tuss' compound eyes were fixed on the small, unassuming human. He saw the way she had moved, the brutal instant shift from passive prey to apex killer. He saw the sheer, unhesitating violence of her attack. It wasn't defensive. It was a slaughter. Harper Tuss clicked His voice was a thin, greedy whisper, trembling with a new kind of fear. Harper looked at him. She wiped the back of her trembling hand across her face, smearing the alien blood into her pale skin. She looked tired, she looked broken. I told you. Harper rasped, her voice cracking. I just don't like loud noises. She looked down at her hands. They were stained orange and red. The ledger board she had been typing on an eternity ago lay in pieces near the Corvethe's heavy boot. The human was small, she was fragile. But as Trouse pressed himself harder against the wall, trying to put as much distance between himself and the bleeding girl as possible, he realized a terrifying truth about the galaxy's newest species. They weren't prey, they were just sleeping. The orange blood on the deck grating was already beginning to congeal, turning from a bright neon liquid into a tacky, gelatinous paste. It smelled like industrial solvent and spoiled meat. Harper stared at it, her chest heaving, the air tearing at the back of her dry throat. Her left arm hung entirely dead. The numbness was fading, replaced by deep, sickening throb that radiated from her dislocated shoulder down to her fingertips. Every time her heart beat, a fresh spike of white, hot agony drove itself into her collarbone. "Tuss," Harper whispered, her voice sounded like crushed glass. The Valen didn't move. He remained pressed into the furthest corner of the ruined kiosk, his compound eyes fixed on the mutilated corpse of the Corveth, then flicking back to Harper. He was clutching his cracked thorax, his mandibles clicking in a rapid, erratic rhythm of absolute panic. "Trekkies, I need you to help me." Harper tried to shift her weight, and the room tilted. Nausea, thick and bitter, rose in her stomach. "My shoulder, it's out of the socket. I can't climb the maintenance ladders with one arm. You butchered it," Tuss stammered, the synthetic translator collar around his thin neck struggled to convey the sheer pitch of his terror, rendering his words in a flat metallic stutter. "You are an administrative caste. You are soft skin. You severed its primary respiratory artery with garbage." "I survived," Harper said flatly. She didn't have the energy for galactic sociology. Her body temperature was dropping. The massive dump of adrenaline was metabolizing, leaving her shivering violently in the ambient chill of the station's lower levels. "If I don't get this arm back in, we don't move. If we don't move, the rest of the boarding party will find us. They will follow the blood trail." She awkwardly shuffled toward the heavy plastel desk the Corsair had ripped away. It lay on its side, a solid, immovable slab of gray polymer. Harper knelt beside it. "I cannot touch you," Tuss rasped, shrinking back. "You are unstable. Your species is biologically deceptive." "Fine." Harper ground her teeth together. A fine sheen of cold sweat coated her forehead, mingling with the smeared orange blood of the dead alien and the red blood trickling from her split eyebrow. "I'll do it myself." She positioned her useless left arm over the edge of the overturned plastel desk. She took a deep, shuddering breath, filling her lungs with the stench of ammonia and fear. She didn't want to do this. The civilized, rational part of her brain screamed to lie down, to close her eyes, to wait for station security to make it all better. But the ancient, pragmatic ape in her hindbrain knew the truth. Nobody was coming. The weak died in the dark. Harper clamped her right hand around the wrist of her dead left arm. She braced her Feet against the floor grating. 1, 2. She didn't wait for 3. Harper violently thrust her entire body weight downward and twisted. The popping sound was wet, heavy, and sickeningly loud. A blinding flash of pain, so intense it tasted like battery acid, exploded. Behind her eyes, Harper screamed a raw, guttural sound that tore her throat and collapsed sideways onto the floor. She lay there for a long minute, her cheek pressed against the cold, vibrating metal. She gasped for air, tears streaming down her face, cutting clean tracks through the grime and gore. Her shoulder burned with a deep, furious ache, but the joint was seated. Her fingers twitched. She had her arm back. Slowly, agonizingly, Harper pushed herself up. She kept her left arm pressed tightly against her ribs to stabilize the torn ligaments. She looked at Tuss. "We are leaving," she breathed. "Main transit hub is compromised." Tuss clicked, his tone defeated. "The Corsairs operate in sweeping pack formations. They will have locked down the elevators to the upper wards." "Then we don't use the elevators," Harper said. She moved toward the dead Corvette. The smell was overpowering. Up close, she forced herself not to gag. She wasn't looking at the aliens' kinetic shredder rifle. It was too heavy. She wouldn't be able to lift it with her bad shoulder, let alone absorb the recoil. Instead, her eyes fell to the creature's heavy utility belt, snapping the thick leather strap with her good hand. She pulled a heavy, serrated survival knife from its sheath. The blade was dark metal, crude and heavy. It felt awkward in her small hand, but the weight was reassuring. She wiped the grip on the canvas of her jumpsuit and slipped it into her own pocket. "The ventilation shafts behind the coolant reservoirs," Harper muttered, looking up at the ceiling. "They bypass Sector 3 entirely and vent directly. The hydroponics bays, we squeeze through there." Tuss stared at her, his mandibles twitching. "You have memorized the structural schematics of the station's exhaust systems." "I memorize all the exits," Harper said softly. "Always." She stepped out of the kiosk and into the corridor. The red emergency strobes were still pulsing, casting long, erratic shadows across the walls. The hallway was a massacre. Bodies of various alien species, grow laborers, brutal mechanics, and dozens of others lay strewn across the deck, torn apart by the heavy kinetic rounds of the pirate weapons. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the scorched plastic smell of weapon discharge. Harper didn't look at the faces of the dead. She couldn't afford the empathy. Empathy was a luxury for a secure environment. Out here in the bleeding iron of the station, she was just a scavenger moving through the brush. She kept low, pressing her back against the cold bulkhead. Her boot slipped slightly on the slick grating, and she adjusted her footing, stepping deliberately, carefully. Every shadow looked like a hulking Corvette. Every hiss of the failing life support sounded like a heavy-breathing predator. "Move," she whispered back to Tuss. Valen followed, his cracked thorax causing him to walk with a severe limp. He kept a wide berth from Harper, treating her with the same cautious reverence one might give a live explosive. They navigated the slaughterhouse of the lower decks. Harper's senses were dialed to an agonizing peak. She felt the micro vibrations of heavy boots on the deck plating long before she heard them. 3 times she dragged Tuss into maintenance alovs or behind stacked cargo crates, pressing a bloody hand over his mandibles to keep him quiet as Squads of heavily armored corsairs stalked past. She watched them through the narrow gaps in the crates. She studied how they moved. They were arrogant. They walked in the center of the corridors. They didn't check their corners. They were apex predators, accustomed to prey that ran blindly in the opposite direction. They didn't expect the prey to hide in the shadows, holding a serrated knife, calculating the exact thickness of the armor at the back of their knees. Harper felt the predatory urge flare up again, a dark, violent whisper urging her to strike the trailing pirate. She clamped down on it hard. Survive, don't hunt. Survive. They reached the coolant reservoirs. The massive cylindrical tanks hummed with immense pressure, the air around them freezing cold and biting against Harper's sweat-drenched skin. Above the secondary tank, shrouded heavy shadows, was the ventilation. Great. Up there, Harper pointed. Tuss looked at the climb. It was 10 ft of slick pipes and exposed wiring. My leg is failing, Harper. My kitten is fractured. I cannot scale that. Harper looked at him. He was a bug, an alien creature that had mocked her fragility. Just hours ago, leaving him would be faster, leaving him would be quieter. The cold reptilian part of her brain calculated his dead weight and suggested walking away. Harper squeezed her eyes shut, fighting a sudden wave of disgust at her own thoughts. She was human, not a monster. Shut up and grab the pipe, Harper growled. I'll push. The ventilation shaft was a sensory deprivation chamber compared to the chaos of the corridor. It was pitch black, freezing cold, and smelled intensely of ozone and metallic dust. The walls were tight, pressing in on Harper's shoulders as she crawled forward on her stomach, dragging her useless left arm by her side. Tuss crawled ahead of her, his multiple limbs making a soft, frantic scuttling sound against the thin tin of the ductwork. Every inch was agony. Harper's right palm was torn open from the plaster shard, leaving smears of blood on the dusty metal beneath her. Her breathing was harsh, echoing loudly in the enclosed space. She had to pause every few feet to swallow the nausea bubbling in her throat. We are close. Tuss' voice filtered back, thin and distorted. The air pressure is changing. The hydroponic sector is below us. Keep moving. Harper rasped. Suddenly, a massive vibration rocked the entire shaft. The thin metal beneath Harper groaned in protest. Dust showered down on her face. A dull, concussive boom echoed through the vents, followed by a series of sharp, staccato cracks. Explosive, Tuss hissed. In a panic, they are breaching the upper bulkheads. They are in the hydroponics wards. Harper stopped. The dark felt heavier now. The hydroponic sector was supposed to be the safe zone. It was where station security usually rallied. If the corsairs were already up there, blasting through the reinforced doors, the security forces were either dead or retreating. Keep going to the grate, Harper ordered, her voice eerily calm. Do not open it, just look. She heard Tuss shuffle forward. A faint sliver of pale green-tinted light suddenly cut through the darkness ahead of her. The Valen had reached the vent cover. I see them, Tuss whispered. 2 corsairs. They have pinned down a security detail behind the water filtration tanks. They are using heavy incendiary weapons. The foliage is burning. Harper dragged herself forward until she was right behind Tuss. She peered through the slats of the metal grate below. The lush green expanse of the hydroponics bay was a war zone. Thick black smoke rolled across the ceiling, obscuring the artificial sunlight lamps. The smell of burning soil and charred organic matter seeped up through the vent, bitter and choking. Two massive corps of pirates stood in the center of the central walkway. They were laughing. Harsh barking sound carried over the crackle of the flames. One of them held a heavy plasma projector, pouring liquid fire into a cluster of metal tanks where a handful of station security guards, mostly avian species, their feathers scorched and useless, were pinned down. They are going to burn them alive. Gus clicked mournfully. There is no escape path. We are trapped in this shaft. Harper stared at the massive predators. She looked at their heavy armor. She looked at the plasma projector. Then she looked at the environment. Above the central walkway, suspended exactly over where the two corvettes stood laughing, was the primary atmospheric regulator, a massive rotating turbine unit that fed concentrated oxygen into the hydroponics bay to simulate a heavy atmosphere. T-Choose, Harper whispered, the structural brackets holding that oxygen turbine to the ceiling. What are they made of? The Valen blinked in the darkness. Standard polysteel. Why move aside? Harper pushed past him, wincing as her dislocated shoulder scraped against the narrow walls of the duct. She reached the grate. She pulled the heavy serrated survival knife from her pocket. Harper, what are you doing? Tuss asked, real terror returning to his voice. You cannot fight them. They have plasma. I'm not going to fight them, Harper said. Softly, she wedged the thick blade of the knife under the latch of the vent. Cover. I'm going to crush them. With a sharp twist of her good wrist, she popped the latch. The metal grate swung downward. With a soft screech, Harper didn't hesitate. She slithered out of the duct, dropping silently onto the broad, flat top of the suspended oxygen turbine. The drop jolted her bad shoulder, and a whimper escaped her lips, but she swallowed it instantly. She was directly above the Corsairs. The heat from the fires below washed over her face, blisteringly hot. The air tasted like ash. She crawled to the edge of the turbine. The massive machine was held to the ceiling by 4 thick poly steel cables anchored into heavy mounting brackets. Harper gripped the serrated survival knife. She crawled to the nearest cable. It was thick, but polysteel wasn't actual metal. It was a hardened industrial polymer designed for tensile strength, not sheer resistance. She began to saw. It was grueling, agonizing work. Her right arm burned with exhaustion. Her torn palm slicked the handle of the knife with fresh blood. The heavy plasma projector below roared again, painting the room in violent purple light. Snap! The first cable gave way. Turbine groaned, shifting slightly. The Corsairs below didn't notice over the sound of their own weapons and the roaring fire. Harper dragged herself to the second cable. She sawed frantically. Her muscles screamed. Her breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. The primitive ape in her brain was howling, feeding her the absolute last reserves of emergency energy. Snap! The turbine lurched violently, dropping several inches. The heavy metal casing groaned. Below, one of the corvettes stopped. Laughing, he looked up, his black eyes trying to pierce the thick smoke gathering near the ceiling. Harper didn't care if they saw her now. She moved to the third cable. She didn't saw. She hacked at it, swinging the Heavy knife like a cleaver, burying the serrated edge into the thick polymer. Over and over again. Up, the Corsair bellowed, raising the plasma projector. Harper struck the cable one final desperate time, snap the third cable. Parted, the massive oxygen turbine, weighing several tons, sheared the final overburdened bracket entirely out of the ceiling. Harper didn't try to hold on. As the massive machine plummeted, she threw herself backward, launching her small body blindly into the thick foliage of a nearby elevated planter bed. She crashed through broad fleshy leaves, the branches whipping across her face and tearing her jumpsuit. She hit the soft, loamy soil hard, tumbling through the dirt until she slammed against the retaining wall. Deafening, catastrophic crash shook the entire sector, the sound of twisting metal and shattering plastel drowned out the fires. A cloud of thick dust and debris exploded upward. The heavy plasma projector let out a dying, high-pitched whine followed by a small, contained explosion. Then silence. Harper lay in the dirt. She couldn't move. Her body was completely, utterly spent. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow, leaving her paralyzed. Shivering and gasping for breath, she stared up at the artificial lights, blinking slowly as ash drifted down onto her face like gray snow. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost its meaning. Eventually, she heard the sound of approaching boots, not the heavy, deliberate thud of the Corvette, but the lighter, hurried footsteps of station security. Flashlight beams cut through the smoke, scanning the wreckage. Over here, a voice shouted, "The turbine fell. It crushed them. The Corsairs are dead." Footsteps rushed toward the planter bed. A beam of white light hit Harper, blinding her. She squinted, raising her good bloodstained hand to shield her eyes. An armored security officer, a reptilian species with green scales, peered over the edge of the planter. He stared at the small, fragile human lying in the dirt. She was covered in mud, ash, orange alien blood, and her own red blood. She looked pathetic. She looked incredibly weak. "Are you injured?" the officer asked, his voice gentle, assuming he was speaking to a terrified civilian who had narrowly escaped a tragic accident. "Did you fall from the walkway?" Harper slowly lowered her hand. She looked past the officer toward the ruined walkway, where the massive turbine rested on top of two flattened armored corpses. She let her head fall back against the dirt. She let out a long, ragged exhale. The prehistoric predator inside her skull finally closed its eyes and went back to sleep. "I'm fine," Harper whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackle of the dying fires. "I just really need a cup of coffee." Did the raw, unpolished survival instinct of humanity send a shiver down your spine? If you loved watching the innocent clerk unleash her inner earthborn predator, hit that like button. Share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gritty HFY tales. What alien species should humanity terrify next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.